The polished marble floors of the Riverside Grand Theater reflected the crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling like stars caught in a frozen lake. It was just past midnight when Elena Vasquez pushed her cleaning cart through the heavy oak doors of the main concert hall, her worn sneakers making soft squeaking sounds against the pristine floor. The enormous space was silent now, empty of the elegant crowds that had filled it just hours before for the evening's symphony performance. But Elena preferred it this way. In the quiet darkness, with only the dim safety lights glowing along the aisles, she could almost pretend that this magnificent theater belonged to her alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena had been cleaning the Riverside Grand Theater for 7 years, ever since she had arrived in the city from a small village in Eastern Europe. She was 42 years old now, though the hard work and long hours had etched lines into her face that made her look older. Her hands were rough and callous from years of scrubbing floors, polishing brass railings, and hauling heavy trash bags. She wore the same gray uniform every night, a simple dress with the theater's embroidered logo on the chest, and her dark hair was always pulled back into a tight bun that had started showing streaks of silver. Most people who worked at the theater barely noticed Elena. She was part of the invisible workforce that kept the building running smoothly, arriving after the performances ended and leaving before the morning rehearsals began. The musicians would brush past her in the hallways without making eye contact. The administrative staff would leave their coffee cups and paperwork scattered across desks for her to clean up. The theater's director had hired her 7 years ago and probably could not remember her name if asked. But Elena did not mind being invisible. In fact, she preferred it. Being overlooked meant she could move through the theater freely, exploring every corner of the building during her night shifts. She had discovered secret passages behind the old stage curtains, found forgotten dressing rooms filled with costumes from productions decades past, and spent countless hours in the empty concert hall, imagining what it would be like to sit among the audience and listen to the orchestra play. What no one at the Riverside Grand Theater knew, what no one in this entire city knew, was that Elena Vasquez had once been a different person entirely. In her former life, in a country thousands of miles away, she had been Elena Mikhailovna Petrova, a promising young pianist who had studied at the prestigious Moscow Conservatory. She had performed in concert halls across Europe, her name printed on elegant programs, her photograph appearing in music magazines. Critics had called her interpretations of Chopin and Rachmaninoff both technically brilliant and emotionally profound. But that life had ended suddenly and completely 15 years ago. Her husband, a journalist who had written articles critical of the government, had been arrested on fabricated charges. Elena had tried to defend him publicly, using her platform as a known musician to speak out about the injustice. Within weeks, her concert bookings had been cancelled. Music schools refused to hire her as a teacher. She had been effectively blacklisted from the only profession she had ever known. When her husband died in prison under suspicious circumstances, Elena had made the painful decision to leave her homeland forever. She had sold everything she owned, changed her name, and used the money to obtain documents that would allow her to start over in America. She had arrived with nothing but a small suitcase and memories of a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely. For the first few years in her new country, Elena had worked any job she could find. She washed dishes in restaurant kitchens, cleaned hotel rooms, and took care of elderly people in their homes. She sent money back to her aging mother who still lived in their village, carefully avoiding any details about how she was earning that money. Her mother still believed Elena was teaching piano at a small music school, and Elena did not have the heart to tell her the truth. The job at the Riverside Grand Theater had felt like a cruel twist of fate when Elena first applied for it. To work in a concert hall, to be surrounded by music every day but never able to participate in it, seemed like a special form of torture. But she had needed the work desperately, and the night shift paid better than most cleaning jobs. She had told herself she would only stay for a few months while she looked for something else. But 7 years had passed, and Elena was still there. Part of her stayed because the job was stable and the pay, while modest, was enough to cover her rent and send money home. but a deeper part of her stayed because she could not quite bring herself to leave the world of music entirely. Even if she was only cleaning up after the musicians rather than being one of them, at least she was still connected to that world in some small way. Elena's nightly routine at the theater followed the same pattern. She would start in the lobby, emptying trash cans and wiping down the marble surfaces. Then she would move to the administrative offices, vacuuming carpets and dusting desks. The backstage areas came next, where she would clean the dressing rooms and organize the chaos that performers always left behind. But she always saved the concert hall itself for last, because that was her favorite part of the building. Tonight, as Elena pushed her cart down the sloping aisle toward the stage, she could still smell the faint scent of expensive perfume lingering in the air from the evening's well-dressed audience. Programs had been left scattered across seats, and she collected them carefully, noting that tonight's performance had featured Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. She had heard the music filtering through the walls while she cleaned the upper floors, and it had made her chest ache with a longing she usually tried to suppress. The stage itself was a massive expanse of polished wood, empty now except for the chairs and music stands that had been left in formation from the evening's performance. But what drew Elena's attention, as it always did, was the concert grand piano that sat at center stage. It was a magnificent instrument, a Steinway Model D with a glossy black finish that gleamed under the safety lights. During performances, it was positioned prominently so the audience could watch the soloist's hands flying across the keys. Elena set down her cleaning supplies and walked slowly across the stage toward the piano. She knew she should not touch it. The musicians were very particular about their instruments, and she had been specifically instructed during her training that the piano was off-limits to cleaning staff. A specialized piano technician came twice a week to maintain it, and no one else was supposed to go near it. But tonight, like so many nights before, Elena could not resist. She approached the piano and ran her fingertips gently along its smooth surface, careful not to leave any marks. The lid was open, revealing the intricate network of strings and hammers inside. Elena leaned forward slightly and breathed in the distinctive smell of wood and metal and felt that it always meant home to her. She pulled out the piano bench and sat down carefully, her heart beating faster with a mixture of guilt and excitement. The bench was positioned at exactly the right height, adjusted for the professional pianist who had performed here earlier. Elena placed her hands above the keys, not quite touching them, and felt the familiar muscle memory returning. Her fingers remembered the position, the gentle curve, the readiness to create music. For several long minutes, Elena sat there with her hands hovering over the keys, fighting an internal battle. She knew that if anyone discovered her sitting at the piano, she would be fired immediately. Security cameras monitored the building, though she had learned over the years which angles they covered and which blind spots existed. She knew that the overnight security guard, an elderly man named Frank, usually spent his shifts watching television in his small office near the loading dock. The temptation was overwhelming. It had been 15 years since Elena had last played a real piano. 15 years since her fingers had produced the sounds that had once defined her entire existence. In her tiny apartment, she could not afford to keep an instrument. She had tried practicing on a cheap electronic keyboard once, but the plastic keys and artificial sound had felt like such a poor imitation that it had only made her loss more painful. Elena looked around the empty concert hall one more time, confirming that she was completely alone. The building was silent except for the distant hum of the heating system. Her hands were trembling slightly as she finally lowered them to the keys. The moment her fingers made contact with the cool ivory, something inside Elena broke open. She pressed down gently on middle C, and the note rang out in the empty hall, pure and clear and heartbreakingly beautiful. The sound seemed to fill not just the physical space around her, but also the hollow emptiness that had lived inside her chest for 15 years. She played another note, then another. Her fingers began moving almost of their own accord, finding a simple melody that she had learned as a child. It was a folk song from her homeland, something her mother used to sing while cooking dinner. Elena's hands remembered how to shape the phrases, how to bring out the sweetness of the melody while maintaining the steady rhythm underneath. As she played, tears began streaming down Elena's face. She was not crying from sadness exactly, though there was certainly grief mixed into her emotions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She was crying because playing the piano again felt like coming home after a long exile. She was crying because her hands still remembered how to make music despite the years of disuse. She was crying because for the first time in 15 years, she felt like herself again. The simple folk song ended, and Elena's hands moved naturally into something more complex. Without consciously deciding to do so, she began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the pieces she had performed countless times during her former career. Her fingers stumbled at first, rusty from lack of practice. But as she continued, the muscle memory grew stronger. The notes began flowing more smoothly. The phrasing became more natural. The dynamics and tempo markings that she had memorized decades ago came back to her. Elena lost herself completely in the music. She forgot about the security cameras and the risk of being discovered. She forgot about her cleaning cart and the work she was supposed to be doing. She forgot about everything except the feel of the keys beneath her fingers and the gorgeous sound filling the concert hall. The Chopin Nocturne was a piece about longing and melancholy, and Elena poured all of her own longing into it. Every note carried the weight of her lost career, her dead husband, her abandoned homeland, and the person she used to be. But the music also contained beauty and hope, reminding her that even in darkness, there could be moments of transcendent loveliness. When the nocturne ended, Elena sat very still with her hands resting on the keys, breathing heavily as if she had just run a great distance. She felt simultaneously drained and energized, heartbroken and healed. For those few minutes, she had been Elena Petrova again, the pianist, rather than Elena Vasquez, the cleaning lady. She knew she should stop now and return to her work before someone discovered her absence. But her hands were already moving to another piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. This was a darker, more powerful composition, full of crashing chords and dramatic intensity. Elena attacked the keys with a passion she had not felt in years, letting out all the anger and frustration she usually kept carefully bottled inside. The music grew louder, more intense. Elena's whole body was engaged now, swaying with the rhythm, leaning into the dramatic moments. She had forgotten how physical piano playing could be, how it engaged not just the fingers but the arms, the back, the core, the entire being. She had forgotten how it felt to pour your soul into music and have it come back transformed into something beautiful and powerful. She was so absorbed in the music that she did not hear the door at the back of the concert hall open. She did not notice the figure standing in the shadows, watching her play. She had no idea that everything was about to change. Elena finished the Rachmaninoff Prelude with a thundering final chord that echoed through the hall. She sat back on the bench, exhausted and exhilarated, her hands trembling from the exertion. It was only then, in the ringing silence that followed, that she heard the slow, deliberate sound of someone clapping. Elena's blood turned to ice. She spun around on the piano bench and saw a man standing in the center aisle about halfway to the stage. Even in the dim lighting, she recognized him immediately. It was Maestro Julian Blackwell, the music director and principal conductor of the Riverside Symphony Orchestra. Maestro Blackwell was a legendary figure in the classical music world, renowned both for his brilliant interpretations and his notoriously difficult personality. He was in his late 50s, tall and imposing with a mane of silver hair that he wore swept back dramatically. He dressed exclusively in expensive black clothing, cultivating an image of sophisticated authority. Under his leadership, the Riverside Symphony had become one of the most respected orchestras in the country. He was also famously arrogant and demanding. Musicians in the orchestra feared his scathing criticisms during rehearsals. Administrative staff dreaded his imperious demands and sudden temper tantrums. He had reduced more than one young performer to tears with his harsh assessments of their playing. But no one could deny his genius or his ability to draw extraordinary performances from his orchestra. Elena stood up quickly from the piano bench, her heart pounding with terror. She had been caught red-handed violating one of the theater's most important rules. She would certainly be fired now, and probably escorted from the building immediately. She thought frantically about the rent payment that was due next week and the money she needed to send to her mother. Maestro Blackwell continued walking slowly down the aisle toward the stage, still clapping in that slow, mocking rhythm. When he reached the front row, he stopped and looked up at Elena with an expression that was difficult to read. His face showed a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and something else that might have been disdain. "Well," he said in his cultured British accent, his voice carrying easily through the excellent acoustics of the concert hall. "I came back to retrieve some sheet music I left in my dressing room, and what do I find? The cleaning lady playing our concert grand as if it were her personal instrument." Elena opened her mouth to apologize, but no words came out. Her mind was racing, searching desperately for something to say that might save her job. But she knew there was no excuse that would satisfy him. She had been caught breaking the rules, and there would be consequences. Maestro Blackwell walked up the short stairs at the side of the stage and approached the piano. He looked at Elena with penetrating dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her. Up close, his presence was even more intimidating. He radiated authority and power, the absolute certainty of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Do you have any idea," he said slowly, his voice quiet but somehow more frightening than if he had shouted, "how much this piano costs?" "It is a Steinway Model D worth nearly $200,000. It is maintained by a specialist who has worked with the greatest pianists in the world. And you, a cleaning woman with dirty hands, sit down and play it as if it were a toy." Elena looked down at her hands and realized with horror that he was right. Her hands were not literally dirty, but they were the rough, work-worn hands of a cleaning lady, not the carefully maintained hands of a concert pianist. She had not thought about that before sitting down to play. She had only been thinking about the music. "I am sorry, Maestro," Elena managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Her accent, which she usually tried to minimize, became more pronounced in her nervousness. "I should not have touched the piano. I will leave now. Please, I need this job." "You will leave when I tell you to leave," Maestro Blackwell said sharply. "First, I want to know where a cleaning lady learned to play Rachmaninoff." Elena hesitated. She had spent 7 years carefully avoiding any conversation that might reveal her past. She had learned to deflect questions about her background, to keep her history hidden behind the anonymous identity of a cleaning woman. But now, standing in front of this famous conductor who had just heard her play, she realized that pretending to be completely ignorant of music would be impossible. "I studied piano," she said carefully, "in my country. A long time ago." Maestro Blackwell's eyebrows rose. "You studied piano," he repeated, his tone making it clear that he found this hard to believe. "Where? At some provincial music school?" Elena felt a flash of anger cut through her fear. The dismissive way he said provincial music school stung more than he could possibly know. But she swallowed her pride and said nothing. She had learned over the years that survival sometimes required accepting other people's low opinions of you. "It does not matter where I studied," she said quietly. "I should not have played your piano. I will clean it carefully and make sure there are no fingerprints. And I promise it will never happen again." "That is the first sensible thing you have said," Maestro Blackwell replied. "But I am curious about something. That was not a simple piece you were playing. The Rachmaninoff Prelude in C-sharp minor requires significant technical skill and musical understanding. Yet you played it from memory, with no sheet music. How is this possible for a cleaning lady?" There was such contempt in the way he said cleaning lady that Elena felt her face flush with humiliation. She understood what he was really saying. How could someone who scrubbed toilets and mopped floors possibly have the cultural knowledge to play serious classical music? In his worldview, cleaning ladies and classical musicians existed in completely separate categories, and the idea that someone could be both was apparently incomprehensible. "I remember the music from when I studied," Elena said, still keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I apologize again, Maestro Blackwell. If you will excuse me, I need to finish my work." She moved toward her cleaning cart, hoping desperately that he would simply let her go. But Maestro Blackwell stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Not so fast," he said. "You have violated a serious rule by playing this piano without permission. I should report you to the theater's management immediately. You would be terminated, and I suspect you would find it difficult to get another job with such a dismissal on your record." Elena felt her stomach drop. He was right. If she were fired from the Riverside Grand Theater for cause, other employers would be suspicious. She had carefully built her reputation as a reliable, trustworthy worker over the past 7 years. Losing that would be devastating. "Please," she said, and she hated how desperate she sounded. "Please do not report me. I have worked here for 7 years. I have never caused any problems. I clean well. Everyone is satisfied with my work. This was the first time I have ever touched the piano." This last statement was a lie, but Maestro Blackwell had no way of knowing that. He studied her face for a long moment, and Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that he was enjoying her distress. There was something almost predatory in his expression, the look of someone who had discovered that he held power over another person and was savoring that power. "Perhaps we can come to an arrangement," he said finally. "I will not report this incident, on one condition." Elena waited, hardly daring to breathe. "You will never touch this piano again," Maestro Blackwell continued. "In fact, you will stay out of this concert hall entirely from now on. Someone else can be assigned to clean it. I do not want to risk having our valuable instruments handled by staff who do not understand their worth. Do we have an understanding?" Elena nodded quickly. She felt relief that she was not being fired, but also a profound sadness. Being banned from the concert hall felt like being exiled from the last place where she felt any connection to her former life. But she had no choice. She needed this job too desperately to argue. "Yes, Maestro," she said quietly. "I understand. Thank you for your mercy." "Mercy has nothing to do with it," he replied coldly. "I simply do not want to deal with the administrative hassle of finding a replacement cleaning person. Now leave. And remember our agreement." Elena grabbed her cleaning cart and hurried toward the exit, desperate to escape from his presence. But just as she reached the door, Maestro Blackwell called out to her. "One more thing," he said. "What is your name?" Elena turned back. "Elena Vasquez, Maestro." He nodded dismissively, as if he were filing away a piece of unimportant information. "Well, Elena Vasquez, consider yourself lucky that I am in a generous mood tonight. Another conductor might not have been so understanding." Elena did not respond. She pushed her cart through the door and let it close behind her, finally allowing herself to breathe normally again. Her hands were still shaking from the encounter, and she felt tears threatening to fall. She had been foolish to take such a risk. Foolish to think she could reclaim even a small piece of her former life without consequences. Maestro Blackwell's contemptuous treatment had reminded her of her place in this world. She was a cleaning lady now, nothing more. Whatever she had been before was gone forever, as dead as her husband, as unreachable as her homeland. Elena finished her cleaning duties mechanically, barely paying attention to what she was doing. Her mind kept replaying the encounter with Maestro Blackwell, analyzing every word, every expression. She felt humiliated by how easily he had reduced her to begging. She felt angry at his arrogance and condescension. But most of all, she felt a deep, aching sadness at being forced to give up the one small comfort she had allowed herself. When her shift finally ended at 6 in the morning, Elena walked out of the Riverside Grand Theater into the gray dawn light. She rode the bus back to her small apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the edge of the city. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her door, unlocked it, and stepped into the single room that contained her entire life. The apartment was tiny and sparsely furnished. A narrow bed against one wall. A small table with 2 chairs. A kitchenette with a hot plate and a mini refrigerator. A bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. On the wall above her bed hung a single photograph, faded and creased from being carried across continents. It showed a younger Elena in an elegant evening gown, standing on a concert stage with a bouquet of flowers in her arms, smiling at something off camera. Elena looked at that photograph for a long time, at the woman she used to be. Then she changed out of her gray cleaning uniform, lay down on her bed, and cried herself to sleep. The weeks that followed Elena's encounter with Maestro Blackwell were among the most difficult she had experienced since arriving in America. True to his command, she was reassigned away from cleaning the concert hall. Instead, her supervisor gave her additional duties in the administrative wing and the storage areas beneath the theater, spaces that felt lifeless and disconnected from the music that still echoed through the building's upper floors. Elena tried to accept this new reality with the same resignation she had learned to apply to all the disappointments in her life. She told herself that she had been foolish to risk everything for a few moments of playing piano. She reminded herself that survival required pragmatism, not sentimentality. She had a roof over her head and enough money to send to her mother. That should be enough. But at night, lying in her small apartment, Elena found herself haunted by the memory of those few minutes at the piano. Her fingers would move unconsciously through the motions of playing, tracing invisible melodies on her blanket. She would wake from dreams where she was performing on stage again, only to find herself in her shabby room with the sound of traffic filtering through the thin walls. The Riverside Symphony Orchestra was in the middle of its spring season, which meant multiple performances each week. Elena could hear fragments of rehearsals and concerts as she went about her work in other parts of the building. The muffled sounds of violins and cellos, the occasional blast of brass, the rhythmic pulse of timpani. Each sound was a reminder of the world she had lost. During her breaks, Elena would sometimes stand in the service corridors where ventilation grates carried sound from the concert hall. She would close her eyes and listen, identifying the pieces being rehearsed, noting which sections the orchestra struggled with, recognizing when Maestro Blackwell stopped the musicians to make corrections. Even these stolen moments of indirect connection to music felt precious to her. One evening about 3 weeks after her encounter with the maestro, Elena was emptying trash bins in the administrative offices when she overheard a conversation that made her pause. Two staff members were talking in worried tones about an upcoming concert. "I don't know what we're going to do," said Margaret Chen, the orchestra's personnel manager. "The concert is in 5 days and we don't have a pianist." "What about the backup we usually call?" asked Thomas Wright, the marketing director. "She's in the hospital with appendicitis. Had emergency surgery yesterday. I've called every pianist in the region who might be qualified to play the Grieg concerto on such short notice. Everyone is either already booked or unwilling to work with Blackwell on such a tight timeline." Elena knew the piece they were discussing. Grieg's Piano Concerto in A minor was one of the most beloved works in the piano repertoire. It was technically demanding and required a soloist who could balance virtuosic passages with lyrical sensitivity. She had performed it herself years ago in Prague, and the memory of that performance was still vivid in her mind. "Blackwell is going to be impossible to deal with if we have to cancel," Thomas said with a sigh. "He's already been in a foul mood for weeks. Yesterday he made 3 orchestra members cry during rehearsal." "I know. But what choice do we have? Unless a qualified pianist materializes out of thin air, we'll have to postpone the concert or substitute a different program entirely." Elena moved away from their office before they could notice her presence. Her mind was racing with possibilities she knew were foolish to entertain. She could play that concerto. She had the technical ability and the musical understanding. But the idea of approaching the orchestra's management or, worse, Maestro Blackwell himself, with such an offer was absurd. Why would they take a cleaning lady seriously? For the rest of her shift, Elena tried to push the thought from her mind. She told herself it was none of her business. Someone else would solve the orchestra's problem. She should focus on her work and be grateful she still had a job after being caught at the piano. But when she returned to her apartment that morning, Elena found herself unable to sleep. She kept thinking about the Grieg concerto, about how the opening notes exploded with passionate intensity, about how the second movement melted into heartrending beauty, about how the finale danced with irrepressible joy. She thought about the audience that would be disappointed if the concert were cancelled. She thought about the musicians who had prepared for this performance. And she thought about Maestro Blackwell's face when he had discovered her playing. Beneath his contempt and anger, she had seen something else in his expression. Surprise, yes, but also a flicker of genuine interest before his arrogance had reasserted itself. He was a serious musician, whatever his personality flaws. He would recognize real ability if it were demonstrated to him properly. Over the next 2 days, Elena wrestled with an idea that grew more insistent despite her attempts to dismiss it. She began making plans that she knew were reckless but felt increasingly necessary. She told herself she was only exploring possibilities, not committing to any actual course of action. But deep down, she knew she had already made her decision. On her day off, Elena took the bus to a neighborhood she rarely visited, where expensive shops catered to professionals and businesspeople. She went into a consignment store that sold high-end clothing at reduced prices. There, she found what she was looking for, a simple but elegant black dress suitable for a concert performance, and a pair of low-heeled black shoes that were comfortable but professional-looking. The purchase took a significant portion of her carefully saved money, but Elena made it anyway. She told herself she could return the items if she changed her mind. She knew this was a lie she was telling herself, but she needed that lie to justify the expense. Back in her apartment, Elena tried on the dress and shoes. She had not worn anything this elegant in 15 years. The woman who looked back at her from the small mirror over her bathroom sink seemed like a stranger. Not the concert pianist she had once been, but not quite the invisible cleaning lady either. Someone in between. Someone trying to reclaim a piece of herself. Elena spent the rest of that day and the following evening doing something she had not done in years. She practiced. Without a piano, this meant sitting at her small kitchen table and working through the entire Grieg concerto from memory, her fingers moving through the motions on the table's surface while she heard the music in her mind. She was surprised by how much she remembered. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath years of disuse. The emotional contours of the piece were still vivid to her. She mentally rehearsed the challenging passages, the places where a soloist could easily make mistakes, the moments where coordination with the orchestra was crucial. But mental practice could only accomplish so much. Elena knew that if she was going to do what she was planning, she would need access to an actual piano before the performance. The instrument she would play in concert was the same Steinway Grand in the concert hall, and she needed to feel those specific keys beneath her fingers, to understand the particular responsiveness of that piano. This meant taking an even greater risk than she had taken on that night when Maestro Blackwell had discovered her. This meant deliberately violating his order to stay away from the concert hall. But Elena had come too far in her planning to turn back now. 3 days before the scheduled concert, Elena arrived at the theater several hours earlier than her usual shift. She had learned over the years when the building was least occupied. On Wednesday afternoons, most of the administrative staff left early. The orchestra was off rehearsing at another venue for a different upcoming performance. The daytime cleaning crew had finished their work. The evening's event was still hours away. Elena used her employee key card to enter through the service entrance. Her hands were shaking as she made her way through the familiar corridors toward the concert hall. Every sound made her jump, certain she would be discovered and confronted. But the building was silent except for the distant hum of the ventilation system. The concert hall was dark when Elena entered. She left the main lights off, using only the safety lights that were always illuminated. It was enough to see by, and the dimness made her feel less exposed. The Steinway Grand was there on stage, exactly as she remembered it, magnificent and inviting. Elena walked down the aisle and climbed the steps to the stage. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She sat down at the piano bench and positioned her hands over the keys. Then she began to play. She started with scales and arpeggios, the basic exercises every pianist uses to warm up. Her fingers were stiff at first, protesting the unfamiliar movements. But gradually they loosened and the movements became more fluid. She worked through major and minor scales in all keys, forcing her hands to remember patterns they had once known intimately. Then Elena began playing the Grieg concerto. She started with the second movement, the adagio, because it was the most lyrical and would help her focus on tone and phrasing rather than technical fireworks. The melody emerged from the piano like a song of longing and remembrance. Elena shaped each phrase carefully, listening critically to the sound she was producing. The piano was even more responsive than she remembered from her brief encounter with it weeks ago. Every subtle gradation of touch produced a corresponding change in tone. It was an instrument capable of infinite expression in the hands of someone who knew how to use it properly. Elena moved on to the first movement, with its dramatic opening and the virtuosic passages that followed. Here her technical limitations became more apparent. Her fingers stumbled over some of the faster runs. Her left hand was not quite coordinated with her right in certain passages. She had to stop and work through the difficult sections slowly, building speed gradually. She had been playing for perhaps an hour when she became aware that she was not alone. The sensation came gradually, a prickling feeling at the back of her neck that told her someone was watching. Elena stopped playing mid-phrase and looked out into the darkened auditorium. At first she saw nothing. Then a figure stood up from one of the seats about 10 rows back. Even in the dim light, Elena recognized the distinctive silhouette and silver hair of Maestro Julian Blackwell. Her blood turned to ice. Of all the people who might have discovered her, it had to be him again. Elena stood up quickly from the piano bench, her mind racing through possible explanations and excuses. But she knew there was nothing she could say that would make this situation acceptable. Maestro Blackwell walked slowly down the aisle toward the stage, his footsteps echoing in the silent hall. When he reached the front, he stood looking up at her with an expression Elena could not quite decipher. Was it anger? Curiosity? Something else? Elena Vasquez, he said, his cultured voice filling the space between them. We meet again under similar circumstances. I believe I gave you very clear instructions about staying away from this concert hall and this piano. Elena opened her mouth to apologize, but Maestro Blackwell held up his hand to silence her. What I find most interesting, he continued, is not that you disobeyed my orders. People defy authority all the time. What interests me is what you were just playing. That was Grieg's Piano Concerto in a minor, unless I am very much mistaken. The same piece we are scheduled to perform in 3 days. The same piece for which we currently have no soloist. He climbed the steps to the stage and walked toward the piano. Elena instinctively took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped between the piano and this intimidating man who held her fate in his hands. How did you know we were planning to perform that particular piece? Maestro Blackwell asked. Orchestra repertoire is not exactly public knowledge weeks in advance. I overheard staff members discussing it, Elena admitted. I heard that your soloist was unable to perform. I see. And you thought what, exactly? That you would practice the piece and offer yourself as a replacement? His tone made it clear how ridiculous he found this idea. Elena lifted her chin slightly. She had already been caught. She had already violated his orders. There was nothing more to lose by speaking honestly. Yes, she said. That is exactly what I thought. Maestro Blackwell stared at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was not a kind laugh, but rather one of disbelief and something that might have been grudging respect. The audacity, he said, shaking his head. A cleaning lady thinks she can perform a major piano concerto with a professional symphony orchestra. You must be either remarkably brave or completely delusional. I can play this concerto, Elena said quietly. I know I am out of practice. I know my technique is not what it once was. But I understand this music. I can perform it. Once was? Maestro Blackwell seized on these words. So you admit that you once played at a higher level. Tell me, Elena Vasquez, who exactly were you before you became a cleaning lady? Elena hesitated. She had kept her past hidden for so long that revealing it felt dangerous. But she realized that if she wanted any chance of being taken seriously, she would have to tell him at least part of the truth. I studied at the Moscow Conservatory, she said. I performed professionally in Europe for several years. I had to leave that life behind when I came to America. Maestro Blackwell's eyebrows rose. The Moscow Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. If Elena was telling the truth, she was not simply someone with amateur piano skills. She had been trained at the highest level. The Moscow Conservatory, he repeated slowly. That is a very specific and verifiable claim. What years were you there? Elena told him. She gave him the names of her primary teachers, all of whom were well-known figures in the piano world. She described the curriculum and the performance requirements. As she spoke, she could see Maestro Blackwell's expression changing. The contemptuous dismissiveness was still there, but it was being tempered by growing interest. If what you are telling me is true, he said when she finished, then you are significantly overqualified to be working as a cleaning lady. Why did you not pursue a musical career when you came to America? That is a long and complicated story, Elena said. One that I do not wish to discuss. What matters is whether I can play this concerto well enough for your concert. Maestro Blackwell walked around the piano, studying Elena as if she were an interesting specimen he had discovered. She could see him calculating, weighing possibilities, considering options. You played the second movement adequately, he said finally. Your phrasing was acceptable, though your tone could be more consistent. But the second movement is the least technically demanding. The first and third movements require virtuosic technique. What I heard before I made my presence known was rough and uneven. I have been practicing on a table in my apartment, Elena said. This is the first time I have touched a real piano in 3 days. Give me a few more hours to practice and I will play better. A few hours? Maestro Blackwell's voice dripped with skepticism. My dear woman, you are talking about performing with a professional orchestra in front of a paying audience. This is not a student recital or a casual gathering. People will have paid significant money for their tickets. Critics will be in attendance. Our orchestra's reputation is at stake. I understand the stakes, Elena said, meeting his gaze directly. I have performed in circumstances far more pressured than this. I am not afraid of audiences or critics. Maestro Blackwell studied her face carefully. Elena had the sense that he was trying to see past her worn appearance to the musician she claimed to be. The silence stretched between them, tense and uncertain. Play the first movement, he said finally. From the beginning. If you can get through it without major errors, I will consider your proposal. But understand that I have very high standards. If your playing is not up to professional level, I will not only refuse your offer but will report you to building management for repeatedly violating rules. Am I clear? Perfectly clear, Elena said. She returned to the piano bench and took a moment to compose herself. Her hands were shaking, partly from fear and partly from the adrenaline coursing through her body. This was her chance. Her one opportunity to prove that she was more than what she appeared to be. Elena placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The opening of Grieg's Piano Concerto in A minor starts with a dramatic downward cascade, a rush of notes that announces the soloist's presence with unmistakable authority. Elena attacked these opening measures with all the passion and energy she could summon. Her fingers found their way through the challenging passages with increasing confidence. Yes, there were rough spots. Yes, her technique was not as polished as it had been in her prime. But the essential understanding of the music was there. The phrasing was musical and intelligent. The difficult runs and arpeggios were executed with sufficient clarity and speed. As Elena played, she forgot about Maestro Blackwell watching her. She forgot about the risk she was taking and the consequences if she failed. There was only the music, flowing from her memory through her fingers to the piano keys. The first movement was a conversation between struggle and triumph, between doubt and certainty. Elena poured her own story into those emotions, playing not just Grieg's notes but her own journey from concert halls to cleaning closets. When she reached the end of the movement's exposition, she did not stop. She continued through the development section, where the themes were transformed and recombined in new ways. Her left hand maintained the rhythmic drive while her right hand sang out the melodic lines. The dialogue between soloist and orchestra, even though only the piano part was present, was clearly articulated. Elena pushed through to the recapitulation, where the main themes returned with even greater intensity. The technical demands increased here, with rapid octave passages and intricate figurations that required both precision and power. Elena's arms were beginning to ache from the unaccustomed exertion, but she did not slow down. She drove toward the movement's conclusion with mounting energy. The first movement ends with an extended cadenza, a solo passage where the pianist can display technical virtuosity and interpretive imagination. This was traditionally a place where performers would add their own improvisatory elements. Elena played the standard cadenza that most pianists used, but she added subtle personal touches to the phrasing and dynamics that showed her understanding of the music's architecture. The final measures of the movement featured thundering octaves and dramatic chord progressions. Elena played them with the full force of her physical strength, her body leaning into the keys, her fingers striking with precision and power. The last chord rang out in the hall, its resonance gradually fading into silence. Elena sat back on the bench, breathing heavily. Her hands were trembling and she could feel sweat on her forehead. She had not played anything that demanding in 15 years, and her body was reminding her of that fact. She looked up at Maestro Blackwell, who had remained standing near the piano throughout her performance. His expression was difficult to read. The contempt and dismissiveness were gone, replaced by something more complex. Surprise, certainly. Interest, possibly. But also what might have been frustration or annoyance at having his assumptions challenged. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at Elena as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Then he walked to the edge of the stage and stared out into the empty auditorium, his back to her. "That was not perfect," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Your octaves were uneven in places. Some of the runs were rushed. Your left hand was occasionally out of synchronization with your right." Elena said nothing. She knew all of this was true. She waited for him to continue. However, Maestro Blackwell turned back to face her. It was also undeniably the playing of someone who understands this concerto at a deep level. Someone who has studied it seriously and performed it before. "You were not exaggerating about your background." "No, Maestro, I was not." He walked back to the piano and leaned against it, crossing his arms across his chest. Elena could see him struggling with some internal conflict, weighing practical considerations against his obvious reluctance to admit he had been wrong about her. "The concert is in 3 days," he said. "That is almost no time to prepare properly. We would need to rehearse with the full orchestra at least twice. You would need to have the entire concerto performance ready, not just the first movement. The third movement is even more technically demanding than what you just played." "I can do it," Elena said with more confidence than she felt. "Give me access to this piano for the next 3 days. Let me practice. I will be ready." "If you fail," Maestro Blackwell said, his voice hard, "if you embarrass yourself and my orchestra in front of our audience and the critics, it will reflect badly on everyone involved. I will be blamed for making a poor choice in desperation. The orchestra will be criticized for an inadequate performance. Our institution's reputation will suffer." "And if I succeed?" Elena asked. Maestro Blackwell's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "If you succeed, Elena Vasquez, then you will have accomplished something quite remarkable. And I will have to admit that I was wrong about you." He walked toward the exit, then paused and looked back at her. "The building will be closed tomorrow for maintenance. You will have the entire day to practice without interruption. I will inform security that you have permission to be here. We will have our first rehearsal with the orchestra tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. Be prepared to play the entire concerto without stops. The musicians will not appreciate having to accommodate an unknown soloist on such short notice." "Thank you, Maestro Blackwell," Elena said quietly. He waved his hand dismissively. "Do not thank me yet. You have not proven anything except that you are less incompetent than I initially believed. Tomorrow evening will be the real test. If you cannot manage a clean read-through with the orchestra, this experiment ends immediately. After he left, Elena remained sitting at the piano for several minutes, trying to absorb what had just happened. She had somehow convinced one of the most demanding conductors in the classical music world to take a chance on her. Now she had to deliver on her bold claims. She looked down at her hands, at the rough skin and short nails that marked her as a woman who worked with her hands. These were not the pampered hands of a concert pianist. But they were her hands, and they would have to be enough. Elena began practicing again, working through the second movement with renewed focus. Then she tackled the third movement, the allegro moderato, with its playful rhythms and demanding technical passages. Each time she made a mistake, she stopped and worked through the problem slowly until she could execute it correctly. Hours passed. The safety lights seemed to grow dimmer as Elena's eyes tired. Her back ached from sitting on the bench. Her fingers were sore and the muscles in her forearms burned. But she kept playing, driven by a determination that surprised even herself. She was not just preparing for a concert. She was reclaiming a part of herself that had been dormant for 15 years. Every note she played was a small act of resurrection, bringing back to life the musician she had been forced to bury. When Elena finally looked up at the clock, she was startled to see that it was nearly midnight. Her regular shift would begin in 6 hours. She should go home and sleep. But she could not stop playing. There was too much to do, too much to remember, too much to perfect. She worked through the entire concerto one more time from beginning to end. This time her playing was more secure. The muscle memory was returning more quickly than she had dared hope. The interpretive ideas she had developed years ago were still present in her mind, waiting to be implemented. As she played the final triumphant measures of the third movement, Elena felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. Not just satisfaction at playing well, but joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at making music. The kind of joy that had originally drawn her to the piano as a child, before careers and politics and tragedy had complicated everything. Elena finally forced herself to leave the theater as dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. She walked through the empty streets toward her apartment, her mind still full of music. She knew she should feel exhausted, but instead she felt more alive than she had in years. The next day passed in a blur of practice and preparation. True to Maestro Blackwell's word, Elena had the building to herself. She spent 8 hours at the piano, working through every challenging passage, refining every phrase, building the stamina she would need for a full performance. By the time the orchestra members began arriving for the evening rehearsal, Elena felt as ready as she possibly could be given the circumstances. She had changed into the black dress and shoes she had purchased, transforming herself from cleaning lady to concert soloist. When she looked at her reflection in the dressing room mirror, she saw someone who was neither Elena Petrova the concert pianist nor Elena Vasquez the cleaning lady, but someone new. Someone who contained both identities. The orchestra members filtered into the concert hall looking curious and skeptical. Word had spread through their ranks that they would be rehearsing with an unknown soloist on extremely short notice. Many of them had heard rumors about a cleaning lady who could play piano, but most assumed this was an exaggeration or a joke. When Elena walked onto the stage and took her place at the piano, she could hear the whispers and murmurs from the orchestra. Some of the musicians recognized her as the woman who cleaned their dressing rooms. Others had never noticed her before. All of them looked doubtful about what was about to happen. Maestro Blackwell entered from the side of the stage and took his position on the conductor's podium. He tapped his baton on the music stand to get everyone's attention. "Good evening," he said in his commanding voice. "As you all know, we have lost our originally scheduled soloist for this week's Grieg concerto. This is Elena Vasquez. She will be performing the piano solo. I expect all of you to give her the same professional respect and attention you would give any other soloist. Now, let us begin." He raised his baton. The orchestra members positioned their instruments. Elena placed her hands over the piano keys, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. This was it. The moment where she would either prove herself or fail spectacularly in front of dozens of professional musicians. Maestro Blackwell gave the downbeat, The orchestra entered with the quiet, mysterious opening that preceded the piano's dramatic entrance. Elena counted the measures, waiting for her moment. Then the conductor's baton gestured toward her, and she attacked the keyboard with the powerful descending run that announced the soloist's arrival. The sound of the piano combining with the full orchestra was overwhelming in the best possible way. Elena had forgotten how thrilling it was to play with other musicians, to be part of a collective creation of something beautiful and powerful. This was so different from practicing alone. This was music as it was meant to be experienced, as a dialogue between soloist and ensemble. The orchestra members quickly realized that Elena was no amateur. Her playing was confident and musical. She navigated the challenging passages with assurance. Most importantly, she listened carefully to what the orchestra was playing and responded to it, maintaining the intricate balance between soloist and accompaniment that made concerto performances work. Maestro Blackwell's conducting was precise and supportive. Whatever his personal feelings about Elena might be, he was professional enough to give her clear cues and maintain tight coordination between piano and orchestra. Elena found herself responding to his gestures, following his tempo choices, matching his vision for how the piece should flow. They worked through the first movement with only a few stops for coordination issues. Then they moved to the lyrical second movement, where Elena's phrasing and tone quality impressed even the skeptical orchestra members. By the time they reached the energetic third movement, the atmosphere in the hall had changed completely. The musicians were no longer playing with reluctance or doubt. They were engaged with the music, responding to Elena's interpretation, adding their own voices to the collaborative performance. When they reached the concerto's triumphant conclusion, several orchestra members spontaneously applauded. Maestro Blackwell lowered his baton and turned to face the orchestra. "That was acceptable," he said, which coming from him was high praise. "We will rehearse again tomorrow night for final polish. But I believe we have a performance." He looked at Elena with an expression that might have been grudging respect. "Elena Vasquez, you have exceeded my very low expectations. Perhaps there is hope for this concert after all." As Elena left the stage, several orchestra musicians approached her to introduce themselves and express their surprise and admiration. The principal cellist, a woman named Diana Park, smiled warmly at her. "That was really beautiful playing," Diana said. "Where have you been hiding? I've never heard of you before." Elena smiled but did not answer directly. "Thank you. It felt wonderful to play with all of you." Over the next 2 days, Elena lived in a state of intense focus and barely contained excitement. She practiced during every available moment, refining her performance, building her confidence. The second rehearsal with the orchestra went even better than the first. Maestro Blackwell seemed almost pleased, though he maintained his demanding demeanor throughout. On the evening of the concert, Elena arrived at the theater several hours early. She had not slept well the night before, her mind too active with anticipation and nervousness. In the dressing room, she carefully prepared herself, putting on the black dress and shoes that had seemed like such an extravagant purchase but now felt exactly right. There was a knock on the dressing room door. When Elena opened it, she found Maestro Blackwell standing there in his formal concert attire, looking as imposing and elegant as ever. "A word before the performance," he said, stepping into the room without waiting for invitation. Elena closed the door and waited for him to speak. She had no idea what to expect from this man who had gone from contemptuous dismissal to grudging acceptance over the past few days. "I owe you an apology," Maestro Blackwell said, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "When I first encountered you playing piano, I made assumptions based on your position and appearance rather than listening to the actual music you were creating. That was wrong of me. You are a serious musician who deserves to be treated as such." Elena was too surprised to respond immediately. This was the last thing she had expected from the arrogant conductor. "Thank you, Maestro," she said finally. "That means more to me than you might realize. Tonight you will perform in front of a significant audience," he continued. "Some of them will know your story. Word has spread about the cleaning lady who will play piano with the symphony. Some people will come expecting a curiosity, a novelty act. Others will be skeptical or dismissive. I understand, Elena said. What I want you to remember, Maestro Blackwell said, looking at her directly, is that your only obligation is to the music itself. Not to me, not to the audience, not to anyone's expectations or assumptions. Just play the Grieg as beautifully as you are capable of playing it. That will be enough. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. I am rarely wrong about musical talent, he said. But when I am wrong, I prefer to be spectacularly wrong. Do not disappoint me, Elena Vasquez. After he left, Elena sat quietly in the dressing room, trying to calm her racing heart. She could hear the sounds of the audience beginning to arrive, the murmur of hundreds of voices filling the concert hall. In less than an hour, she would walk onto that stage and face all those people. She thought about her mother in the village back home, who still believed her daughter was teaching piano at a small music school. She thought about her husband, dead these 15 years, who had believed in her talent even when her career was destroyed. She thought about all the years of cleaning floors and emptying trash bins, all the while carrying within her the memory of who she had once been. Tonight, Elena would show everyone, including herself, that the person she had been was not completely gone. That person had just been waiting, dormant but not dead, for the right moment to emerge again. When the stage manager knocked on her door to tell her it was time, Elena stood up and looked one last time at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked nervous but determined. Scared but ready. Elena took a deep breath, opened the door, and walked toward the stage where her future was waiting. The concert hall was filled to capacity. Elena stood in the wings, watching as the orchestra members took their places on stage. The audience chatter created a constant hum of anticipation. She could see people flipping through their programs, reading about the mysterious soloist who had replaced the originally scheduled performer. Maestro Blackwell strode onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. He bowed briefly, then turned to the orchestra. The hall grew quiet as he raised his baton for the opening piece, a Brahms symphony that would precede the Grieg concerto. Elena watched from backstage, using this time to center herself and push away the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. When the Brahms concluded, the stage crew quickly rearranged chairs to make room for the piano concerto setup. This was the moment. Elena heard her name announced over the sound system, introducing her simply as Elena Vasquez, pianist. No credentials, no background, just her name. She walked onto the stage. The bright lights made it difficult to see individual faces in the audience, which was both comforting and disorienting. She could sense the curiosity radiating from hundreds of people who had heard whispers about the cleaning lady turned soloist. Some had come hoping to witness something remarkable. Others expected to see someone fail. Elena sat at the piano bench and adjusted her position. She placed her hands gently on the keys, feeling their familiar coolness. Maestro Blackwell caught her eye and nodded slightly. She nodded back. He raised his baton. The orchestra began with the quiet, mysterious introduction. Elena counted measures, her heart steady now despite the pressure. When her entrance arrived, she struck the keys with absolute commitment, the powerful descending cascade announcing her presence with authority. From the first notes, Elena knew this performance would be different from the rehearsals. The energy of the live audience, the high stakes, the realization that this might be her only chance to reclaim her identity as a musician, all of it fueled her playing with an intensity she had not accessed in years. Her fingers flew through the virtuosic passages with clarity and precision. The lyrical moments sang with genuine emotion. She listened intently to the orchestra, responding to their musical gestures, creating a true dialogue between soloist and ensemble. Maestro Blackwell's conducting was impeccable, supporting her choices while maintaining the work's architectural integrity. The first movement built to its conclusion with mounting drama. When the final chord rang out, there was a brief pause before the second movement began. Elena used those few seconds to take a breath and prepare for the emotional shift ahead. The Adagio movement was where Elena poured her heart most completely. This was music about longing and loss, about beauty existing alongside sorrow. She thought about her husband, about her homeland, about all the years she had spent hiding who she really was. Every phrase carried that weight of memory and grief, but also acceptance and hope. The audience was utterly silent. Even the usual coughs and rustles that characterize any concert had ceased. People were leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed by what they were hearing. This was not just competent playing. This was artistry of a rare and moving kind. The third movement exploded with joyful energy after the introspective second movement. Elena's fingers danced across the keys, executing the playful rhythms and demanding technical passages with confidence that came from deep understanding of the music. The orchestra matched her enthusiasm, the collaboration between soloist and musicians reaching its highest point. As Elena approached the concerto's final measures, she felt a profound sense of completion. Not just of the piece itself, but of a journey that had begun 15 years ago when she lost everything. She had survived. She had endured. And now she was proving that the essential part of who she was could never truly be taken away. The last triumphant chords resonated through the hall. Elena lifted her hands from the keys. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the audience erupted. People leaped to their feet, applauding with an enthusiasm that shook the building. The ovation went on, wave after wave of appreciation and amazement. Orchestra members were standing at their positions, adding their applause to the audience's. Even Maestro Blackwell, who rarely showed emotion publicly, was clapping with genuine warmth. Elena stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. Maestro Blackwell gestured for her to take another bow, then another. The applause continued unabated for several minutes. Finally, the ovation began to subside. Elena left the stage, her legs shaking from adrenaline and emotion. In the wings, orchestra members crowded around her, offering congratulations and expressing their astonishment at what they had just witnessed. The concert concluded with another orchestral piece, but Elena knew that the Grieg performance would be what everyone remembered. When the final notes faded and the audience filed out, Elena remained in her dressing room, trying to process what had just happened. There was a knock on the door. Maestro Blackwell entered, still in his formal concert attire. He looked at Elena for a long moment before speaking. "That was extraordinary," he said simply. "I have worked with many soloists over my career. What you did tonight ranks among the finest performances I have witnessed. Thank you, Maestro, for giving me this chance." "I gave you nothing," he replied. "You earned this through your ability and determination. I merely stopped standing in your way." He paused, then continued. "The orchestra has a full season ahead. We perform major concertos regularly. I would like you to consider performing with us again. Properly this time, with advanced preparation and appropriate compensation." Elena felt fresh tears forming. "I would be honored." "There's also the matter of your current employment," Maestro Blackwell said with a slight smile. "I think we can agree that cleaning floors is not the best use of your talents. I will speak with the orchestra's board about creating a position for you, perhaps teaching or working with our educational programs." Over the following weeks, Elena's life transformed in ways she had never imagined possible. The concert had been recorded and clips circulated online, garnering widespread attention. Music critics praised her performance. Several orchestras reached out about future engagements. The story of the cleaning lady who stunned a concert hall captured public imagination. But more important than the external recognition was the internal restoration Elena experienced. She was no longer hiding or diminishing herself. She had reclaimed her identity as a musician and integrated it with the person she had become through years of struggle and survival. Elena eventually established a small teaching studio, working with students who reminded her of her younger self, people with talent and passion who needed someone to believe in them. She performed regularly with the Riverside Symphony and guest appearances with other orchestras. And yes, she finally earned enough to send more money home and eventually bring her elderly mother to America. When people asked Elena about that night at the Riverside Grand Theater, she would smile and say it was not really about proving anything to Maestro Blackwell or the audience. It was about proving to herself that the essential core of who she was had survived intact through all the losses and compromises and years of invisibility. Music had saved her once by giving her a career and an identity. then it saved her again by reminding her that some gifts cannot be destroyed, only temporarily hidden. And when the right moment finally arrived, those gifts could emerge again, perhaps even more powerful for having been tested by adversity. The piano that had once represented everything she had lost became the instrument of her resurrection. And the man who had tried to silence her became, inadvertently, the catalyst for her return to the life she was meant to live. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.